Katerina Yakov watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yakov saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies as never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review for January 28th, 2021. This is our, I believe it's the second show of the year, if I'm not correct, or if I am correct, I should say. Anyway, maybe it's the third show of the year, now that I come to think of it. Boy, year's already shooting right by. Anyway, let me introduce myself to you. I'm Chris Driscoll, your co-host, along with my other co-host, Rainer Shea. How you doing, Rainer?
Hello. What I first want to discuss is the article that I showed you from Stephen Roach, who we have discussed on this podcast before, but I remain somewhat skeptical of, because as you said, he's a big deal in bourgeois economic circles, and he's making this prediction about how the dollar is going to crash within this next year. And you know, as Marxists, we've tended to be right when it's come to subjects involving collapse, the decline of the system. But would you say that Stephen Roach is operating upon a flawed methodology, one that relies on the austerity ideology? Or would you say that he's correct and that we can, in fact, expect something like a 30% or so drop in the dollar's value by the end of 2021?
Well, that's a complex issue. First of all, we should introduce this subject. This it refers to an article this morning, I believe, in Bloomberg, on Bloomberg's website. And it is entitled, let me see if I can find it here. Oh yeah, the dollar's crash is only just beginning. And this article is by a very prominent American economist. His name is Stephen Roach. He's a faculty member at Yale University. He's the former chairman of Morgan Stanley Asia, and he's the former Morgan Stanley chief economist for the entire Morgan Stanley all around the world. And he's author of many books, one of which, Unbalanced, the Codependency of America and China. Anyway, it's a kind of an interesting article. I'm glad you brought it to my attention, Rainer. I'm going to read you just a couple of graphs from the column. I guess you'd call it an op-ed, an op-ed column, opinion piece. Some people would refer to it. Anyway, Mr. Roach, Stephen Roach, he says, after an initial spike higher, the dollar has been falling steadily since the COVID-19 pandemic took hold in the US last March. It is down about 10% to 12% relative to America's major trading partners, dropping to its weakest level since early 2018, as measured by several of the broad dollar indexes. There is more to come, he says. Based on a wildly unpopular forecast that I made in June of a 35% decline in the value of the dollar by the end of 2021, we are only in the third inning of a 9-inning baseball game. If that forecast comes to pass, it will provide an important exclamation point on the first year in office for America's 49th president, Joe Biden. The dollar is trading at its lowest level against its major peers since early 2018. There were three main reasons why I argued, this is still Roach talking, why I argued the dollar would fall. Number one, a sharp widening in U.S. Current account deficit. Two, the rise of the euro. And three, a Federal Reserve that would do little in response to any weakening of the greenback. On each of these counts, I have greater conviction on the weak dollar call today than I did 6 months ago. So that gives you a drift, an idea. Now, I agree with Roach, with Stephen Roach, Professor Roach, I guess we could call him. I agree with him that we're going to see a dollar crash in this year. I highly suspect, highly anticipate. I don't agree with his reasons. I mean, those are minor contributing factors, but those aren't the reasons. The reason is the further decline of the American empire, the fact that under the Trump regime over the last 4 years, Trump seems to have been deliberately pushing it towards the edge. And as a result, many countries in the third world and in the first world, many countries feel that now is the time to strike out with their independence. Not just anti-imperialist countries either. I mean, many of America's reliable imperialist allies in Europe can be seen fleeing the dollar. The Trump regime and the Obama regime before that have both been pushing China, Russia, Iran, Syria, Venezuela, been pushing these independent countries, these non-aligned countries, these anti-imperialist countries, into fleeing the dollar as a reserve currency. And they have been busy creating other alternatives to the US dollar as a reserve currency. That's why I think, on top of the fact of the COVID-19 pandemic, plague, as I call it, as I think it properly should be called, and on top of the worst depression the world has seen since the 1930s, at the very least, probably since before that, because it's probably, when all is said and done, when it's all analyzed in the end, it'll probably be determined that it was a worse depression than the depression of the 1930s. So those are my reasons. You can say it in a couple of words, or actually one word: crisis of overproduction. No, that's 3 words: crisis of overproduction. These people have a crisis of overproduction combined with a humongous pandemic, combined with the decline of the unilateral hegemonic power, the the American empire. Those are my reasons. So what do you think? Do you think that the dollar is stronger than I and many other Marxist economists say it is? And do you think that Roach is wrong? Where are you on this, Rainer?
This is what I've been trying to figure out. This is why I've been reaching out to you, this guy who's been studying this topic for decades. You evidently have a ton of knowledge that I'm very eager to continue to absorb. And I've gotten confused about it because Roach, his predictions are certainly in line with the kinds of trends that we've been observing about how capitalism is screwing itself. But it seemed like he's leaned on reasoning that it involves the austerity ideology, the idea that it's all the fault of the federal, or that the Federal Reserve has a larger role in it than the Marxist point of view would suggest. And this is the dissonance that I've been trying to parse out, to overcome in reaching out to you about this and hearing your perspective, the geopolitical events, the crisis of overproduction. It all makes sense. It all makes sense that that these are the reasons why this is going to happen. And it certainly makes sense that this is going to happen, that a 30% or so decline in the dollar's value by the end of this year is going to happen. And this the thing about this issue is it feels so abstract, a lot like the banking system and the causes behind the 2008 financial crash. It feels really abstract to somebody who's not studied this very in depth. So now we can try to figure out what's going to happen when this crash occurs. What's going to happen on the ground to the average person. From what I've been reading, it's going to be an increase in the price of goods, a decline in spending power. And this is, of course, going to further perpetuate the cycle of austerity and inequality and the decline in living standards.
Yes, absolutely. You are correct, sir. Absolutely, that will happen if we allow it. And the alternative of not allowing it really requires us to become revolutionary, become socialist revolutionaries. It's that simple. It requires us to take our destiny in our own hands and overturn the capitalist political economy, overturn the capitalist political state, capitalist ruling class, and replace it. Lenin always called it or Marx and Lenin actually always called it a dictatorship of the proletariat. Well, that sounds kind of ominous to the American ear. And I would prefer just to call it a democratic control by the working class, which is, after all, 70% of the American public, along with the allies of the working class, farmers, small business people, many segments of the middle class have in the past traditionally been allies of the working class. Now, the working class has been beaten and battered so badly in the last half century in this country that we don't see much evidence of even the possibility of an alliance between segments of the middle class and the working class. But I have in my lifetime seen that. I'll tell you an example. I remember when I lived in New Mexico, 1978, 1979, and there was a big strike on the New Mexico Colorado border, right at where I-25 crosses over from New Mexico into Colorado. That's big coal country, and that was the site of a very famous strike called the Ludlow Massacre back more than a century ago. And at this time in the late 70s, there was a big strike going on, a coal miners' strike. And I went there along with a lot of other socialists, a lot of other revolutionaries, a lot of other labor activists. We went in a caravan to give our aid, to march on the picket line with those people. That was when I lived in New Mexico, in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So it was about maybe a 4-hour drive from us, something like that. And my eyes were blown wide open as soon as I entered this town. It's called Raton. I think Raton's either I can't remember if it's in Colorado or New Mexico, but it's Raton is the name of the town. And going through this town, all the shops, and these were just little shops that, small business people owned. Every single shop had a sign in it. We support our miners, right? So, when they see which side their bread is buttered on, these are their customers. They support the right side. They take the right side. That's an example of what happens just because of economics. So, this can happen also. In any case, I also want to point out too that we Marxists, Marx himself wrote a lot about, shabby fiscal policies versus good fiscal policies, monetary policies, good monetary policies versus shabby monetary policies. Marx did not believe in just wildly printing money as the Fed has been doing. The Fed's been, printed out probably tens of trillions of dollars by now just on this go around. That's not to mention the $17 trillion the Fed printed out and sprinkled over the economy, over Wall Street, basically, in 2008. So, no, we do not agree with that kind of footloose, fancy-free monetary, inflationary policy at all. That is not Look at any Marxist country in the world and you will see sound monetary policy, sound fiscal policy. So no, Marxists do not disagree with Stephen Roach about the idea that there should be sound monetary policy, especially around your money supply. You know, Marx has, I believe, several chapters in the first volume of Capital on money and the role money plays in the economy. And he's very specific about that. So, you know, it's not that we disagree with Roach about that. I just disagree with those three. Out of those three issues that Roach raised that he thinks are the paramount issues, I disagree with that. I don't think that those are the paramount issues. Although, you know, quantitative easing, as I've explained what quantitative easing is before. Hopefully you have a grasp of what it is, but it's basically what I call helicopter money. Many people call it that. It's the Fed printing, you know, dollars out of thin air and sprinkling it all over, or showering it, I should say, all over the Wall Street, all over the already billionaires, all over the Fortune 500. And it's a disastrous way to go about doing things in the end, because it's highly inflationary. It destroys your currency. And that's what these idiots, the Obamas, the Trumps, and now, you know, what's his name, Biden is getting into doing the same thing with his own alleviation. Now, we do agree with the idea that we need relief and we need it fast, just not in the way the capitalist idiots are paying for it, by creating money out of nothing, which is just inflation. That's all they're doing, is creating inflation. It will hit the economy in the next couple of years. You will see massive inflation to make up for what they're printing out of thin air. We agree that, not just agree, we're emphatic that it should be much larger. The actual relief, COVID-19 relief, and just relief in general, relief from the economy that's been so automated that people all over are losing their jobs. More and more people are getting kicked out of the economy, so they're not even included in official unemployment figures. You know, the way we pay for it is the question. I mean, the first thing we should do is confiscate all the ill-gotten wealth of the billionaires. I saw something today, a friend of mine put something online that said that if you confiscated all but $1 billion from all the billionaires in the world, it would be enough to pay to make sure that nobody starved in this world for 241 years in the future. That's astounding to me, if you think about it. You know, if we confiscated all but $1 billion, leave them with $1 billion, they'd still be extremely fabulously wealthy, and we could still pay for all Americans to have a livable guaranteed income in perpetuity, not just one check, not just one $600 check or one $1,400 check that'll be gone with the wind because everybody's got debts up the yin yang, up the wazoo, I'm sorry, to pay, and it'll be gone before they get it. It is already gone before they get it, for most people, for the overwhelming majority of American working class people. So anyway, any more thoughts on that?
Like I said, brimming with knowledge.
Well,
Let's move on to the next topic.
yeah, that's been a special interest of mine pretty much all my life, the economics. I've studied Marxist economics, but I have also just grudgingly studied bourgeois economics. I've taken a few college classes in it, essentially, and then read a lot about it, researched a lot. So yeah, let's move on because it's already not. Let's see. Let's move on. Where did we go? Let me gotta get a different chart up here. There it is. Okay. So, next on the list is compensating for capitalism's crisis by leaning into big tech by Rainer Shea. And I'm really looking forward to this one.
This is the extension of what we've just been talking about, how the system has been trying to compensate for its crisis, particularly in this last decade or so, by taking drastic measures like giving all the billionaires free money and pumping tens of trillions of dollars of made up fabricated BS currency into the system. And another component to this systemic compensation for collapse is leaning onto the high tech sector. It's no coincidence that Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Twitter, etc., have been the companies that have mainly benefited from the crises of this last year or so. And you may have heard that in this last month, I think it was, Elon Musk became the single richest person, and Bezos and Gates are, of course, also way up there. So leaning onto big tech is turning into capitalism's, or at least U.S. capitalism's, strategy for compensating for the collapse of neoliberalism and the decline of U.S. imperialism. We see that Washington is economically isolating itself, not just from its fellow biggest two powers, Russia and China, but from so many of Washington's imperialist allies in Europe and other places. It's really alienating the world, as well as having its internal economic machine become increasingly deficient, as tens of millions of jobs have been lost in this last year, and so many of them aren't coming back. Something like 15%, I think, is a fair estimate of the U.S. workforce is now jobless, despite how the bourgeois media claims that the unemployment rate is around 6%. That's totally absurd. And the way that the system is dealing with this is consolidating the job market into these big tech companies. This is what we were able to observe even from the first few weeks and months after the pandemic really hit the US in February, March of last year. So many people were losing their jobs, getting their businesses closed down. Well, the big tech companies were able to really monopolize the job market and get a bunch of people to, or get a certain limited amount of people to pledge their allegiance to these corporations. Well, the CEOs of these corporations collectively gained tens of billions, more like hundreds of billions of dollars. It's been something like $1 trillion gained by US billionaires in this last year alone. And like I said, so much of the people who have, among these billionaires who have benefited from this boon, have been the big tech CEOs. So to keep this internal boon for US imperialism going, the system is going to keep integrating big tech's gadgets and services into the economy, into the U.S. infrastructure. We've discussed on this show before that that the big tech companies, in coordination with the military and with the intelligence community, plans to create a near future that's smart, as they call it, where they have these smart cities where there's an Internet of Things with all of our daily appliances being hooked up to the internet, and cars have been totally replaced with self-driving cars, and retail has been totally replaced with home delivery services. Obviously, that's going to make Amazon even more of a monopoly. Plus, freaky stuff like the integration of cameras thoroughly onto all the streets. The consequence of this rapid technological boom of this advertised Great Reset, which the Biden administration is so eager to help carry out, is going to be a weird dissonance where we're told that society is recovering. We're told that capitalism is entering into a new golden age, but where the rich are going to be the main ones who will benefit from these technologies. I mean, I doubt the people in the poor neighborhoods are going to suddenly be able to access all of these wondrous conveniences. Is going to be the rich that mainly, perhaps even overwhelmingly, benefit from these technologies, and the poor are mainly going to be subjected to technologies' potentials for perpetuating violence, such as increased surveillance, such as tightened censorship against political dissidents, such as the technological upgrading of the militarized police. And all the while, the system is going to keep telling us that this is all evidence of capitalism's recovery, but really it's a compensation for the pretty much steady decline in profits that U.S. capitalism has been experiencing in this last half century.
You know what strikes me the worst about all this? So great job, by the way. That's really, and these are really important observations. What strikes me most is just the sheer public hypocrisy of it all, especially when it comes to the surveillance stuff. We know from whistleblowers like Edward Snowden that the United States and its toadies over in the UK, they have the capability of listening in to every electronic device, every communications, tapping into every computer on the face of the fucking earth. And they do. They spy on everyone. They spy on China. They spy on Russia. Despite China's heavy internet firewall, cyber firewall, as they call it, they're still breaking in. And that's why China needs that cyber Great Wall. And yet, these same hypocrites in Washington, on Wall Street, they ruined WeChat and TikTok as examples. I think Microsoft has bought the American assets of WeChat now. They've ruined these companies in a way. I mean, the companies will hopefully survive, but and not just them, Huawei, many other Chinese based or Chinese affiliated somehow companies. You know, I mean, TikTok's owned by an American. who worked in Silicon Valley for many years. So, but they do have plants, facilities in China, and they use Chinese workers to help them do their stuff. And even they were uh, attacked. And their reasoning, the capitalist ruling class and their political minions, their lapdogs in Washington, they claim that China is trying to spy on Americans through these technologies with absolutely no evidence. They have presented no technical explanation for what they claim. They have presented no evidence against these Chinese companies. They they present no evidence, and yet they do that. And then in the meantime, we know that they are spying on China and Russia and everywhere else in the world, including every single human being in America. The sheer hypocrisy is incredible to me. But this whole thing, yeah, I mean, they definitely are. Big tech seems to have been coming out as one of the big winners in COVID-19. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? They're certainly taking advantage of it. So yeah, this is bad news. Okay, more on that?
No, let's move on.
Okay, another one from Rainer Shea. The U.S. empire's very limited options for conquests. And yeah, this is this is a conundrum for them, isn't it? Anyway.
Yeah. The U.S. can't realistically achieve regime change in so many of the countries that it's so desperately trying to conquer. Certainly not China, not Russia, not Iran. They've been trying to subdue these countries for so long, but already a multipolar world order has emerged, and China and Russia have been militarily strengthening their alliance. So there's no reversing the fall of the American-dominated world order, and it really doesn't seem like they'll ever be able to achieve regime change in Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, not even Bolivia, given the incredible strength of the socialist indigenous movement there. So their options for conquest, and by they I mean the collective imperialist settler colonial forces backed by the West, their options for conquest are so incredibly limited. All that they've been able to really move towards doing in terms of expansion in this last year, like sustainable expansion, I don't even know how sustainable this expansion is conquering certain parts of Yemen by getting Saudi Arabia to inflict massive violence and a manufactured oil crisis and a blockade upon the Yemenis, and crippling their society, killing so many of their people, starving so many of their people, so that Israel has then been able to swoop in and start moving towards establishing settler colonies within certain parts of Yemen and gaining a what they aspire to be a permanent military foothold within Yemen. I view this as more of a consolidation of imperial power than as a conquering, because it's relied on an incomprehensible amount of bloodshed so that they can make room for their regional attack dog Israel to establish little colonies within Yemen. And recently we've seen how Pompeo designated the Yemeni Houthi rebels as a terrorist organization, and how Biden, it seems, is going to continue to engage in the trends that have contributed to the Yemen war. By this, I mean Biden's team is probably going to continue treating Yemen as a ground for proxy warfare against Iran, which is going to perpetuate the trends that I've talked about in Yemen. And this seems to be the fullest extent of what the U.S. and Israel, etc., can do in terms of conquest. This is the full extent of where their designs can go.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes. This they are in a tight spot. They are in a conundrum. I don't feel sorry for them. I'm happy to see them in a tight spot and in a conundrum. But as the evil empire continues in its long collapse, actually not so long, because I mean, empires of the past took much longer to collapse than empires of the present and of the last century or so have. Empires have collapsed very quickly during in that period, and this one is collapsing quite quickly too. I mean, it may not seem that way to us because we're talking about in historic terms, but I mean, in terms of a person's life, it might seem like this is drudging on forever. When will we ever get to the point where we can just push this decrepit old system over, stomp on its decayed body, and put something better in its place? But yeah, they're definitely having this conundrum, and a lot of it is really just all the result of their collapse. They haven't collapsed yet. I mean, as a matter of fact, they're still an extremely powerful entity, but as a hegemon, I think it's already over for them. I don't think they are a hegemon anymore. They're still acting like they are a hegemon, but the rest of the world is not acting like they are a hegemon anymore because the rest of the world sees. I guess they're going to be the last to know. So, yeah, good job once again. Anything more on that?
No, I like moving forward more quickly like this.
Good. Okay. Next point. President Xi Jinping champions multilateralism at Davos. That's the World Economic Forum at Davos. And I guess that's in Switzerland, isn't it? Correct me if I'm wrong. And takes aim at American policies. This was quite an interesting speech that President Xi gave on Monday. And I think it's quite incredible. It's really, Xi's really taken the kid gloves off. I'll put it to you that way. President Putin also gave a very similar speech. So I won't even get into that one. But anyway, just let me just read a little bit from this article published in Global Times, which is the daily tabloid national newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party. Addressing the World Economic Forum on Monday night, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a stern repudiation of bullying tactics, ideological prejudice and hatred, as well as economic decoupling and sanctions, which he warned could push the world into division and confrontation, and offered an inclusive multilateral approach that would guide the world out of darkness. Through the speech, China is also sounding the alarm and offering constructive suggestions for future China-US relations, Chinese observers noted. In the notably sharp-toned speech, the Chinese president did not name any specific country, but the extensive references of unilateral and populist trends were clearly aimed at policies orchestrated by the US government over the past several years, which have not only plunged the US into disarray, but also disrupted global cooperation to tackle COVID-19 pandemic and other challenges, Chinese analysts noted. While criticizing these toxic policies, Xi also mounted a staunch defense of inclusive multilateralism based on a mutual respect and equality that transcends ideological and political differences, vowing that China will play a more active role in promoting open, inclusive, and balanced economic globalization. The stress on mutual respect and equality could also be viewed as a basis for rebuilding China-US relations under a new US administration, analysts pointed out. Now, I think this was an extraordinary speech. You go, I'd like to, I haven't yet, but I'd like to download an exact text of the speech and read the whole thing because it sounds like it was really extraordinary. And President Xi was both at the same time pointing out the biggest obstacles, the biggest threat really to global security, the biggest obstacles to conquering the COVID-19 pandemic worldwide and to conquering the global depression and to conquering major ecological existential threats against humanity, as well as nuclear threats against humanity. And he's pointing out the rational way to solve all these problems, and also pointing out where the problem lies in getting there. And the main obstacle right now seems to be the American empire, the belligerent, brutal American empire. So anyway, I just wanted to bring this to people's attention. You can find this article that I refer to in Global Times from January 25th, and it's by Wang Kong, C-O-N-G. Yeah, like kind of like King Kong. He's Wang Kong. Xi champions multilateralism at Davos, takes aim at U.S. policies. And like I said, you can get it on Global Times. Great newspaper, by the way.
The People's Republic of China keeps proving itself to be a force for good overall in the world, like in terms of the environment, in terms of moving towards peace, in terms of promoting human well-being. I keep saying that China is one of the few countries that's had its population's living standards increase in this last year, as opposed to almost every other country to the capitalist world, where something like 150 million people have been pushed into poverty in these capitalist countries. But in China, somehow living standards have increased, and this is how China is winning credibility, perceived credibility, among so much of the globe, like in Italy, which last year defied the wishes of its imperialist allies and joined up with China's new Silk Road. It's how China is winning credibility among powers like the Philippines and Thailand, which have becoming more economically and or militarily partnered with China in recent years, to the chagrin, if that's the right word, of Washington.
Chagrin is the perfect word for that. Couldn't have chosen better, even with my handy thesaurus. But yes, I agree. Okay, moving right along at the steady clip. Neoliberalism is why over 2 million people have died from the pandemic. Rainer Shea.
I'm trying to get to the source of it. I'm trying to explain why something so monumentally tragic has happened. This hasn't been inevitable. This hasn't been just a stroke of bad luck. It's been the result of the socioeconomic system that dominates the globe. I've been looking at the numbers of the countries that have had the most and least COVID deaths, and I've seen how China, despite having a population several times larger than the United States, has had just under 5,000 COVID-19 deaths, whereas the United States has now had well over 400,000 COVID-19 deaths. And I imagine in these next few months, it's going to rise up to 500,000. Where will it go from there? 1 million, 2 million, worst case scenario that people were freaking out about something like a year ago. It's insanity. There doesn't seem to be any limit to it when this kind of insane neoliberal ideology is what dominates. Because from the start, I've been looking at the social trends, the cultural trends, the social systems that have been at play when this pandemic has been wreaking havoc in the worst ways in countries like the United States and Brazil and the UK and India. And I've concluded that it's worst in these countries because these countries have given so many people no other choice than to expose themselves to the risk of getting infected. And it's deprived so many people, especially in the United States, of the ability to access healthcare. The United States is infamously the only major country without some sort of universal healthcare program, and this has no doubt contributed to the fact that it has by far the most COVID-19 deaths. And we've seen how parallel trends towards neoliberalism and capitalist accelerationism has occurred in Brazil since Jair Bolsonaro was elected in 2018. And right before COVID-19 started wreaking havoc in the US, Brazil, etc., people were observing just how far neoliberalism had gone. People were observing just how bad things had gotten. In February of 2020, almost a year ago, there was one article from, I don't remember what his name was, but he concluded that Bolsonaro had destroyed Brazil in 400 days. How Bolsonaro had effectively gutted the public school system. How he was depriving so many people of jobs, of social services, throwing millions under the bus. And it was then no surprise that Brazil became one of the most impacted countries after COVID-19 hit. Neoliberalism breeds public health crises, and socialism is proving itself to be the best system for tamping down public health crises.
Yeah, you mentioned Bolsonaro. I just read an article yesterday, I believe, there have been huge demonstrations just over this last weekend in Brazil demanding the impeachment of Bolsonaro because of his handling of the pandemic, first of all, but also the general economy. People are more and more enraged there, and the movement's really growing. The amazing thing is, while and I'll be talking about this a couple of points from now, but all of the focus of the U.S. news media has been on these demonstrations in Russia, which pulled out far, far fewer people, over this Navalny criminal. Navalny, just by the way, was just indicted in Britain for a theft scheme that he was involved in, basically a scheme to rob from people. This guy is a criminal, but yeah, this is neoliberalism is why 2 million, I think I saw it today, it was 2.13 million people in the world have died from this pandemic. Close approaching 500,000 people in America. The number right now is 200. I'm sorry, 300.
400.
Yep, 400. That's right, 419,000 people have died so far. And as you say, I mean, you said a few months. I don't even think it's going to take that long to hit 500,000. I would say, by sometime, we're just entering February by now. By sometime at the end of February, we'll see that half million mark passed. It's just incredible. Capitalism fucks things up. Socialism fixes things. Socialism is the real democracy. Socialism is the real freedom. And I hope to the gods, I'd even pray to gods if there were any up there. I hope that people are seeing this more and more, and I'm pretty sure they are, seeing that capitalism fucks things up, socialism fixes things. Socialism makes life better. Capitalism makes most of our lives a pure hell. And people are really feeling that. Many tens and tens of millions of people are feeling that in America right now under the triple whammy of the onerous police state that's really come out with its ugly head in this last year, under the weight of the pandemic, the plague, and under the weight of the worst economic crash, the worst economic decline, the worst economic depression since the 1930s. So let's see. Next, we have the U.S. will lose the Cold War with China before collapsing. Wow. Rainer. I like hearing that. Let's hear what you got to say.
I'm fascinated by all aspects of the ideological conflict that's emerged over China in these last few years. It seems like it's been in these last couple years that China has become such a focal point for ideological conflict within the United States. And like was the case during the Cold War, the side that's primarily backing Washington's opponent in this geopolitical battle is the Marxist-Leninists, is the people who are most principled in opposing imperialism and in calling it like it is when it comes to geopolitics and socioeconomics and the BS that the State Department puts out. And it's the Marxist-Leninists against many of the anarchists, even some of the Maoists, the people who describe themselves as the Maoists, against the Trotskyists, against the democratic socialists, and against the liberal and rightist factions. So there's this situation that we Marxist-Leninists find ourselves in the United States, where we're under siege from all these factions that are trying to shove it down our throat that China is evil. But all these people are reacting to something. They're reacting to the fact that the United States is going to lose the Cold War with China, and to the fact that Marxism-Leninism is becoming the primary force in world politics. It's incredible how much China has risen in these last 2 decades alone, to the chagrin of Washington, and it's incredible how rapidly the situation has been evolving in this last year, in particular, as COVID-19 has further established the credibility of the PRC's socioeconomic system, and as COVID-19 has exposed the U.S. for being something drifting towards a failed state. We've seen how in this last week or so, NPR and I think it was The Economist and the New York Times, they all started putting out these smear pieces against China to try to discredit China's COVID-19 response and paint it as excessive, fundamentally flawed, heavy-handed. One infamous New York Times headline posited the idea that perhaps China has been too successful at fighting COVID-19. So we see wild distortions of reality like these to compensate for the fact that the geopolitical situation is racing towards a point that's extremely unfavorable to the US NATO imperialists. In the coming years, projects the Pentagon analyst that I've been reading, the United States is going to fall further into mass unemployment, into deterioration of infrastructure, into natural disasters that the system isn't going to be able to handle. And the system's only invasions and severe censorship of the zones within the United States that the Army occupies, and crazy domestic warfare outcomes like these. At which point there will be a big opening for the Marxist-Leninists, the people who have been ridiculed and spat upon and resisted by virtually every other U.S. political faction from the start of this, to put forth our political line and advance our cause. I think that many of the people in the U.S. will be caught in this dystopian situation, the situation of impoverishment and violence and future pandemics even worse than COVID-19. They'll see the line that we're putting forth of replacing the capitalist state with the proletarian-run democracy, and they'll find it appealing. Because when you read The State and Revolution, so many things make sense. So many of the lies you've been taught about communism, they get cleared up.
Yes, they do. They certainly do. Yeah, you said a couple of years. It seems that China's been in their sights. I'd say 9 years exactly, because that's when Obama started his pivot to Asia, which was really just Orwellian speak for attack on China.
I mean, like in
Full-on
narrative
attack.
terms.
Pardon
And
me?
I mean in narrative terms, because for the first couple of years of the Trump presidency, it was Russia that was perpetually demonized.
Yeah.
Then in early 2019, it shifted towards China amid the Hong Kong protests, or rather the Hong Kong riots, along with the escalation of the Xinjiang propaganda.
Yeah, well, they've certainly stepped it up a bit. Russia too was still, under the gun, as well, like what I was describing, what I'll be describing more in the next topic we get to. But Russia's, really in their sights as well. Why? Because Russia and China have a very tight alliance. It's not a formalized thing. It's just a good friendship based on mutual interests, on mutual need, based on the fact that they're neighbors, and they're neighbors who are both under attack from the same evil empire. So yeah, it's. I agree with you 100%. China, uh, the U.S. will lose the Cold War they have started against China before collapsing. I think we'll see this collapse. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but I'm sure you will see it in yours. And I'm sure most of our audience will see it in their lifetime. So, yeah, definitely. Okay, on to the next topic. U.S. interventionists are back with Russia in their sights. And this is another this is another article, also published on June 25th from Global Times.
January
And
20. You mean
January
January?
25th. Yeah, so you can go to Global Times, January 25th. Just use your favorite online search engine and find it. And so I'm just going to read you a few graphs from this. It's a really great article. It's by, I'm not quite sure how to pronounce this, Choi, C-U-I, Choi Hang. Anyway, Choi Hang says, on Saturday, Moscow and a large number of Russian cities witnessed protests in support of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, calling for his release. According to Western media outlets, more than 3,000 protesters were arrested. The U.S. on Saturday called on Russian authorities to release the protesters, condemning what it called harsh tactics against them. Quite a few Western media cannot hide their excitement. The New York Times argued that Russians are unhappy with their government. The BBC quoted Navalny's supporters as saying, "Russia will be free." As it turns out, the US played a role in hyping up the protests. Just as global analysts have predicted, the Democratic Party, now in majority political power, is not a good thing for Russia. The U.S. Embassy in Russia announced the time and location of the demonstrations even before they took place. After the protests broke out, the embassy accused the Russian government of suppressing the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. The series of moves proves that the U.S. Democrat Party is again upholding interventionism. The Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs expressed strong opposition against the U.S. move to incite violence in that country. While busy condemning Russia, the new U.S. administration did not mention a single word about the Capitol riots earlier this month in Washington. Its double standards have thus been laid bare. U.S. President Biden has said America is back. He believes that returning to the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization means that the U.S. has returned to global order, to the global order it has shaped. But by intervening in Russian protests, it seems that the U.S., which pursues interventionism and creates instability worldwide, is now back. And that's couldn't be more true. Uh, this points out such a huge hypocrisy on the part of the Americans. They've been kvetching and complaining since 2015, especially the Democrat Party, the CIA, and the State Department. They have been complaining, kvetching about Russian meddling in America while not presenting any evidence for that charge. There is no evidence because it's untrue. And yet, meanwhile, here they are, right out in the broad, right out in the open, instigating violent protests. And you should see the pictures of these protests in Russia. They only included maybe 10,000 people at the most across the country. I mean, they weren't the gigantic things the Americans are claiming. And they were incredibly violent. They were attacking police with clubs and metal rods. They were setting things on fire. This was a riot. It wasn't a peaceful protest. And that is the MO of the CIA. When the CIA is inside, instigating these kind of things in a foreign country and in a deliberate intervention aimed at regime change, this is their MO. This is what they've done. This is what they started doing in Libya in 2011 and in Syria in 2000 what was it, 14? Or no, I'm sorry, 2011, and in Ukraine, right on the Russian border in 2014. This is what they do. This is pure interventionism. It's hypocrisy to the nth degree because they kvetch and complain about America meddling in American affairs, which Russia never did. They can't give any evidence for it. But we have plenty of evidence right here. Hell, it was on the fucking website of the American embassy in Moscow that they were intervening, that they were organizing these protests. I wouldn't be surprised if these idiots declare Navalny the legitimate president of Russia, like the idiots did with Guaido in Venezuela. What a joke that has come out to be. No wonder America has become such a laughingstock throughout the world. The pure hypocrisy, and they don't seem to be fazed at all. They say this, they don't seem to be embarrassed by their hypocrisy. It's just utterly amazing to me. Rainer, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Well, will this result in something like what we saw in Libya almost 10 years ago? Will this result in something like what we saw in Bolivia a little over a year ago? I doubt that there's going to be another big break for U.S. imperialist color revolution tactics in this next decade. Though there are some potential openings, like in Thailand or maybe even in Lebanon, though it seems like Lebanon has held fast in its ability to retain its its Hezbollah representation. Because remember that Washington's big goal with its color revolution attempts in Lebanon has been to unseat Hezbollah within the country.
Right.
And even this, they haven't really been able to succeed. They've been able to demonize Hezbollah in the minds of the U.S. public, but they haven't been able to actually succeed in changing who has the power in these countries. They were able to succeed in Bolivia momentarily, but then the strength of Bolivia's indigenous socialist movement proved to be far too much for the empire and its proxies to handle. And they're not going to establish some new Pinochet dictatorship in Bolivia. That Bolivia belongs to the indigenous and to the socialists of that country. So this seems to be the full extent of what the empire can do with its color revolution tactics. Pretty much all it can do is convince Americans that certain leaders like Putin or Xi Jinping or Assad or Hezbollah leaders that they're evil, and that they're supposed to be interpreted as enemies of Americans, of the American definition of freedom and all that vapidness. But it can't change the material situation. It can't change the geopolitical order.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, Russia isn't Bolivia, and Vladimir Putin is not Evo Morales. Evo Morales deserves some of the credit for that coup. Because he laid his country bare. He did not defend them. He did not even build a fucking militia to defend them like they do in Venezuela. I was I liked Evo for a good long time, for the decade that he was in power, but I'm glad he's not in power anymore, because he was a little bit delusional. He was a little bit too much of a utopian social democrat. He was not being realistic about the enemy he faced, and he laid his country bare to them, and they came in, and with 10% of the population of Bolivia, they took over, they being the American imperialists. That's not going to happen in Russia. Vladimir Putin, by the way, even in this terrible time of economic depression, of COVID-19 pandemic that's really hit Russia hard, even with all that, Vladimir Putin has a 60% approval rating, which is higher than any American president has had in decades. And I'm sure once Biden has shown what he's all about in a couple of months from now, his approval ratings will plummet, and they'll be down in the 40 or under 50%, like 40% range. This is it's incredible to me. But anyway, let's move on. One more topic to go, and this one's another Rainer Shea. Rainer has been prolific in the last week or so. Anxiety to maintain imperialist cultural hegemony.
This is once again an extension of what we talked about in the last topic. I feel like this podcast flows so beautifully sometimes. I think this really speaks to the heart of the issue that we're talking about, in terms of internal imperialist austerity, in terms of the futility of most modern U.S. imperialist intervention attempts, in terms of the decline of capitalism, and U.S. capitalism in particular, amid this moment of geopolitical shifts and crises for the system. We've seen how the system has been doubling down on trying to maintain U.S. imperialist cultural hegemony, on trying to keep the American people convinced that their way of life is under threat from countries like Russia, China, Iran, etc. And there's a real dissonance here, because amid this new Cold War, the imperialist media is perpetually pushing the narrative that if Washington takes the right actions, if Washington continues to militarily build up against these countries and keep intervening in these countries, then the world order is going to be flipped, and the 20th century situation of U.S. domination will suddenly be restored. This is the narrative that New York Times' Brett Stevens pushed this last week, when he claimed that the Navalny protests, they're just the beginning, that in these next few years, Russia, Cuba, Venezuela, even China, he somehow was able to confidently include China in this list. All these countries are suddenly going to be regime changed. They're gonna be conquered by the imperialists, and they're gonna be freedomed, like Iraq was freedomed, like Libya was freedomed, and 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 a utopia, a new golden age of techno-plutocratic domination will reign throughout the world forever. Obviously, this is ridiculous. This doesn't reflect the reality at all. And it seems like the only function that this kind of propaganda can serve is to keep the masses within the core of the empire from mobilizing towards revolution, from seriously questioning the imperialist system that they're surrounded by. If Americans are focused on supposed threats from foreign powers, they're less likely to examine the nature of the class system. And even if some of the Americans become leftists, start looking into gaining class consciousness, so long as they view countries like China, the DPRK, Cuba, socialist countries like these as evil, authoritarian, oppressive, dictatorial, autocratic, then they're not going to come towards the agenda of proletarian revolution. They're just going to go off into some sketchy ideology like Trotskyism, or an idealistic utopian ideology like anarchism, or an outright social fascist ideology like democratic socialism. This is the nature of the imperialist cultural hegemony that we're dealing with. This is how the empire aims to retain its hold, at least over the countries that it still firmly controls. Because the trend within U.S. imperialism amid its decline is to turn inward, to exploit the U.S. workers more, and of course the workers in all these countries that are firmly under Washington's thumb, and to enact more austerity and to further disempower the lower classes within these core imperialist countries, as well as in the neo-colonies of the empire. And the way to prevent revolution, the way to stop an overturning of this internal imperialist system, is to inculcate the masses with nonsense about foreign powers being out to get them, and about the existing socialist countries being oppressive, so that a serious mass movement towards proletarian revolution won't develop. Hopefully we Marxists will be able to overcome this. Actually, I believe we Marxists will be able to overcome this. As Mao said, the replacement of the capitalist system with the socialist system is inevitable, regardless of an individual will. As much as the reactionaries tried to turn back the wheel of history, the forces of Marxist development are still going to apply. Marx isn't going to be proven wrong just because certain people in the core of the global empire happen to think that Xi Jinping is a bad guy whose face should be put on a picture of Winnie the Pooh.
The cultural hegemony, as the Italian Marxist-Leninist Antonio Gramsci called it, is basically just an apparatus, a cultural system that allows the imperialists to get into people's brains, to control people's thinking by presenting them with a narrative of reality that's not real, but that's kind of pretty and kind of entertaining and kind of fun, you know. I mean, I enjoy American, manufactured culture. A lot of it, it's good fun, it's entertainment, it's distracting, but it points up to the fact that this cultural hegemony is still very strong. It's one of their few remaining assets, I would say. And I think we will begin to see it fray. We all have already begun to see it fray. I mean, the COVID plague has dug deeply into the Hollywood level of production, for example. The Depression has dug very deep into it. The whole Depression, the long Depression, as my favorite Marxist economist Michael Roberts calls it, since 2008. I don't know if you've noticed this, but the big networks, they used to produce 25 shows in a series a year, and now they're down to, most of them are down to like 13 shows in a year, or 10 shows in a year, or 8 shows in a season, in a year. Basically, they call it a season, but it's a year. I mean, their ability just to produce sheer amounts of production is incredibly decreased recently. There's a lot more of it because of the burgeoning of cable outlets and so forth. But when you add it all up, I'd say it's probably in quantity far less than it was prior to 2008. Prior really to like 2001 was the big strike, the Hollywood TV writers strike, the screen it.
2008.
Yeah, see, now that was a crucial time right there because they used that strike as a way to allow them to get out of producing a whole fuckload of stuff that they produced before. They made it into a new normal, that they produce less. So there's that aspect, but it's still a very powerful thing around the world. I mean, people watch American TV shows and American movies and listen to American rock and roll and British rock and roll and British TV and British movies all around the world, and because the English language has become a language that's at least a second language, or maybe even a third language for a huge part of the world, they have an entree into that. It's a fascinating thing, but I believe in the long run we're going to see, but not even in the long run. I believe in this coming few years we're going to see a deterioration of the power of the American cultural hegemony to go along with the decline in the power of the American political economic hegemony that we are seeing and that we have seen in the last several years. So, yeah, good points. Okay, anything more on that?
Well, you do observe something about how with COVID-19, there's been something of an exposure of the well, where do we seem to be going at in terms of this, an exposure of the vapidness of U.S. consumer culture. So many people living in these conditions, living at home, they've gotten bored, they've gotten depressed, they've gotten disillusioned with the system. They've seen how big tech has been exploiting the crisis. They've experienced the madness of the electronic hallucination, which has emerged, especially since 2008. The modern social media culture. They see the toxicity. They see the addictiveness. They see the system is producing, and the madness and absurdity of what the system tells them to care about. And they're hoping for a breakthrough into a new paradigm. Let's help bring them this paradigm through promoting promoting Marxism. This is what I'm trying to do with my you could call it infotainment. That's kind of a cynical word, but I like to think of my articles as infotainment material that brings people joy and excitement while educating them.
Yeah, good way to look at it. Because you got to keep the reader's attention. You've got to keep them glued to that screen during the time that you're presenting what you're presenting. So it's not a bad way to think. So yeah, interesting discussion there. Interesting topic. We'll have to delve further into it and keep our eyes on it as things progress or deteriorate, as the case may be. Okay, so with that, I think we're out of here. I'd like to thank you, Rainer, for the yeoman's job you've done this evening, carrying the big brunt of the effort tonight. Thanks to everyone who tuned in and watched or listened. And we'll be back next week. Until then, adieu.